All right, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Yusuf Munayer. I am the head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And we thank you very much for joining us for this webinar entitled What Comes Next in Gaza. After nearly 2 years of relentless bombing, destruction, and mass atrocities in Gaza, the Israeli government is threatening to deepen its military campaign by laying further waste to the remains of Gaza City. We've convened a panel of experts to discuss the current situation on the ground in Gaza and around the world as a growing number of states continue to break with Israel over its conduct in the besieged strip. This panel will highlight the current humanitarian situation in Gaza, the impact of Israel's siege policies, and the politics of various aid schemes, the domestic political situation in Israel, and how that is shaping Israeli decision making, as well as the regional and global picture as Israel and the United States become more diplomatically isolated, and what, if anything, remains of ceasefire negotiations. Among the many questions we'll seek to answer are how have Israel's policies around humanitarian aid and international organizations led to starvation in Gaza? Has Israel's military calculus around Gaza shifted at all after its war with Iran and developments on the ground and internationally? What divisions inside Israeli decision-making spaces are likely to shape outcomes? What exactly is U.S. policy now towards the situation in Gaza and the future of the Palestinian people? And where do ceasefire negotiations stand, and what stands in the way of them? We're very fortunate to have a wonderful group of experts to talk through these questions today. For today's conversation, we'll begin with 10 minutes of remarks from each panelist, followed by moderators' questions and Q&A with our audience. Please note that you do not need to wait until the Q&A portion to submit your questions for our speakers today. You can send in questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. In the interest of time, I want to move directly to briefly introducing our guests now in the order that they will be presenting, and then starting the discussion. So we're very happy to have with us today Yara Asi, who is a non-resident fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and also an assistant professor at the School of Global Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central Florida. And we also have Maureen Rabbani, a researcher and analyst commentator specializing on Palestinian affairs and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He is also co-editor of Jadaliya, where he hosts the Connections podcast. Deanna Butu is a lawyer specializing in negotiations, international law, and international human rights law, a former advisor to the negotiating team at the PLO, and has been a fellow at the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center of Harvard's Kennedy School. Last but not least, of course, Jeremy Scahill is an investigative journalist and a co-founder of Dropsite News, and he's reported from war and conflict zones around the world, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and the former Yugoslavia, and is the author of a number of different books and works in journalism. So we're very happy to have you all with us today to dig through this issue and these questions. And we'll begin with Yara, if you would, for your introductory remarks.
Great. Thank you, Yusuf. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And of course, I'm really looking forward to learning from my fellow amazing panelists as well. You know, Yusuf, in your opening remarks, you mentioned something about the very future of the Palestinians as a people. And I think we're really at a moment where that is one of the guiding principles of any discussion about Gaza or any Palestinian suffering across historic Palestine. Just hours ago, I woke to the news that El Manara Square in Ramallah was raided by Israeli tanks. And not that we needed the reminder, but this should serve as a reminder that this is, while we're talking about Gaza today, this is a period of heightened attack on the Palestinians as a people, no matter where they are in historic Palestine. And so we really need to see all this contextually in that framing. The purpose is the manifestation is different, obviously, but it is really troubling. And I think it's a really existential period. So, focusing on Gaza, just yesterday, I think probably most of our audience was made aware of the attack on Nasser Hospital that killed 20 people, including 5 journalists. This follows just about a week of there was an attack outside Al Shifa Hospital at the Al Jazeera tent where they killed multiple journalists as well. Um, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and Yusuf, you and I have talked about this at length on our Hawar podcast. I've been writing about this, as have many others, for years, and it is somehow worse than it has ever been. We are now to the point where the IPC, which is the Global Famine Watchdog, has officially declared famine across the Gaza Governorate, which encompasses the area around Gaza City in North Gaza. And it is the reports we're seeing from humanitarian agencies about malnutrition, starving children, pregnant women, elderly, disabled, and now spreading to the rest of the population, the assumption is that by September, if conditions do not change significantly, famine will spread. Now, people in Gaza have been telling us that they are hungry for almost 2 years. Human Rights Watch indicated that starvation was being used as a weapon of war in December of 2023. So this is a process. Famine is a man-made process that an Israeli official after Israeli official has essentially told us they are trying to create, and we are to the point where they are successful in doing so. So the question is not really how did we get to this point in terms of Israeli policy, but how have so many actors stood on the sidelines and literally watched a man-made famine develop? And when famine is declared, it's not like we can stop it today. We can't suddenly open the gates for aid, flood all the aid in as people have been calling for, and end this. This will require significant, serious intervention for months and perhaps for some of these people, years. And in the way we know that famine works, generational costs will be borne from these decisions or lack of decisions that have been made in the past 2 years. So, how do we talk about this? How do we consider this? And I want to touch on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, of course. So in March, right towards the end of this second ceasefire, Gaza imposed a complete siege of the Gaza Strip. Now they had imposed a siege, of course, earlier, shortly after October 7th. But if you look at the truckloads, the data from trucks crossing the border, you will see that in early March, absolutely nothing entered Gaza for almost 3 months. No food, no medicine, no baby formula, no fuel for generators, absolutely nothing. And we are now seeing the ramifications of that. What Israel has told the world, despite any evidence for this, is that the reason that they had to create an alternate mechanism, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, although I have to interrupt and say, of course, Israel does not claim that it created this, although we now know through investigative journalism that this was a plan created by Israeli and American businessmen as early as 2023. And it was only just implemented in spring 2025. But their claim is that the aid is stolen, multiple invests by Hamas and other groups in the Gaza Strip, multiple investigative reports, including internal American USAID reports, show that there's no evidence for this. But as usual, this is the pretext that was used to create even further restriction and more opportunities for displacement and violence. That's what we're seeing. The evacuation orders, the quote unquote evacuation orders, have escalated. So now there is very, very little space. I think less than 20% of Gaza that is considered a non-militarized zone. And by the standards of the Israeli military, if you are in what they consider militarized zone, you are essentially an open target. And I've I encourage people to read. I think I published a piece in late June about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and its kind of shady origins and practices. But what we know is at least 1,000 Palestinians have been killed at or near these sites trying to get aid. There's been many videos of this, people getting shot. There has been testimonies from aid workers on the ground, health workers on the ground, witness statements. There is an endless amount at this point of not just evidence from Palestinians, but evidence from American contractors working in the Gaza Strip saying that essentially we are told to shoot as not just crowd control, but as a control mechanism, as a threat. If they come before we say it's open, shoot them. If they cross, certain lines, shoot them. They acknowledge that they are being told this, and we're seeing this play out in the injuries that are received in local hospitals. So 1,000 people who are starving or were trying to provide food for their starving families have been killed trying to get that food. This has been called a death zone. This has been called the killing fields. Every humanitarian organization has criticized the functioning of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And although recently we did see reports that several of them had, I don't know if it's coordinated, but at least attempted to perhaps coordinate with this organization. I think we still need more details on what exactly happened there. But the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation took what was a UN system, imperfect, and there was still, of course, hunger and deprivation, a system of more than 400 aid sites all across Gaza, north, central, and south, and has concentrated all of the aid distribution to 4 sites in the south. This forces displacement. This forces, if you've seen the photos from the sites, crowding like you wouldn't believe of course, desperate people trying to get food, and then these opportunities for these murders. So as of today, there has been no real push to by any external actor to dismantle, to delegitimize the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. As we speak, it is the only source of aid for Palestinians in Gaza. Now, the UN has continued to show that it has hundreds, perhaps thousands of trucks waiting at the borders that are unable to come in. So right now, I think that the main issue is famine and continued malnutrition. We've already seen at least hundreds of deaths from malnutrition and also from the consequences of malnutrition. So a lot of the deaths that we're seeing are from people whose bodies have weakened so much or their immune systems have weakened so much that they're unable to fight regular infections, to otherwise keep people who would have been healthy with adequate nutrition to keep them healthy. So that is what predicated this designation of famine. So Israel has, of course, cracked down on every other aid group operating in Gaza. I think UNRWA is probably the primary example, but they have, if you go to the social media of the IDF, of COGAT, they continue to pursue this narrative that they are doing their best to get aid into the Gaza Strip. And so it is this kind of dystopian vision when you see starving people, starving children. Every credible agency in the entire world is telling you that they're trying to get in food and the Israelis are not letting them. And there is still this narrative that Israel is not withholding aid. Now, I want to go to how the world is reacting to this very briefly, because I know my co-panelists are going to touch on this. But it seems that unlike all the murders, the amputations, the tens of thousands of orphans, the countless tragic personal stories that we could mention that we have talked about, the paramedics that were murdered. I could honestly just list on and on. It seems that the images and reality of famine and starvation unfolding have caused some shift, not significant, but some shift in global perception of how Israel is behaving. And we've seen increased recognition of genocide, including by 2 Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel, just a few weeks ago at this point. We have seen increased calls for recognition of a Palestinian state, although without intervention immediately, it is unclear to me the mechanism that these actors intend to actually stop the famine today by promising recognition of a Palestinian state months from now. We have seen a few days ago, Norway's largest wealth fund has divested from the US construction group Caterpillar, which has been a prime target of the BDS campaign, as well as five Israeli banking groups. And they specifically cited, quote, unacceptable risk that the companies contribute to serious violations of the rights of individuals in situations of war and conflict. So they are tying this directly to Israel's actions. Now, these things tend to happen very slowly, I think if you ask many, we are way, way, way too late on these actions. These should have been considered um, maybe decades ago, but it is showing that there is potentially some line that we may not know of, but that external actors are unwilling to continue to support Israel in this. Now, does it help the Palestinians today on the ground? Not fast enough. But I do think, and again, I think my co-panelists will expand on this, there is some push that shows that the humanitarian situation is become so unacceptable and it has gone on for so long. And the narrative that this is about hostages or about Hamas has been so utterly obliterated, including by statements of Israeli politicians, that there might be some opportunity for movement here. We're seeing US public opinion in terms of is this or is this not genocide significantly change. I saw a poll just released yesterday that showed something like 41% of Americans recognize, either consider it a genocide or consider it akin to genocide. These are numbers in the US that we are not used to seeing in discussion of Israel. So Israel is proving basically all the warnings from early October 2023 absolutely correct. And the question now is, what will it take to stop them?
Thank you very much for that, Yara. We'll turn now to Maureen. Maureen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Arab Center for organizing this event and to you, Yusuf, for moderating it. And it's a real pleasure to be in such august company with my co-panelists. I'd like to briefly speak about first the changing strategic environment in the Middle East, and then secondly about recent international responses and what they might mean. As you may recall, in October of 2023, Israel was caught entirely by surprise. Its security doctrine, and more importantly, the concepts underpinning this doctrine essentially collapsed in the space of a few hours. Chaos and disarray reigned, and Israel's initial response to the Palestinian attacks on southern Israel was essentially governed by the twin motives of bloodlust and revenge. And it was conducted with such ferocity that it was really within a matter of days that we began to hear the first warnings about genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And of course, it's only increased since then. But the point I would like to focus on is that initially, apart from bloodlust and revenge, and statements that it wanted to expel the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip and so on, there was no clear strategy governing Israel's actions. It didn't have a clear objective, a clear strategic objective. That began to change, I would argue, in the summer of last year, 2024. Israel began to regain confidence and began increasingly to go on the offensive and believed, and I think primarily because of the unlimited support and indulgence, primarily from the Biden administration in the US, but also from the European Union and key European states like Britain and Germany, began to go on the offensive with a view that it was in a position to fundamentally alter the strategic equation in the Middle East, that it was capable and being given enough space to achieve what I would call a 1967 moment, a defeat of its adversaries individually and collectively, so comprehensive that for an entire generation, the Middle East would live in Israel's image. Now, if Israel's traditional security doctrine is that its enemies must be deterred from ever even thinking of attacking Israel. And if there is going to be an armed conflict, it needs to be short, decisive, and fought on enemy territory. October 1973, of course, challenged that, but more importantly, October 2023 showed that it was no longer a viable security doctrine. And this was replaced by a new one where Israel needed to deal decisively with any emerging or potential threat. And most importantly, it needed to focus on dismantling the self proclaimed axis of resistance, first by severing their links with each other, in other words, isolating its various elements from acting in solidarity with the Gaza Strip, and then dismantling them one after the other. Now, from Israel's perspective, the axis of resistance, as it often says, is an octopus with Iran at its head. And therefore, we began to see the massive attack on Lebanon to seek to neutralize Hezbollah, the growing series of attacks on Yemen, the continuing attacks on Syria, which, although Israel claimed credit for the ouster of the Assad regime, I think it was more of a contributing factor. And then ultimately, this past June, the war Israel launched against Iran. And essentially, Israel is now claiming freedom of action throughout the entire Middle East. I think the December massive attacks on Syria are a case in point where any state in the Middle East capable of defending itself against Israeli aggression is considered a threat that needs to be neutralized. You'll recall when Syria's new rulers took power in December, they went out of their way to mollify Israel. And this absolutely did not serve them in any way, and in no way restrained Israel from seizing additional Syrian territory or seeking to eliminate its entire military capacity. So so that's where we are today, where Israel is constantly on the offensive. There's growing talk of a renewed round of hostilities with Iran. Growing talk of a renewed Israeli offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon and so on. And in doing so, Israel, still acting with the full support of the West, is essentially seeking to subordinate the entire Middle East to its will, where even a capacity for self-defense among any of the non-state actors or conventional militaries in the region will be considered an existential threat by Israel and dealt with accordingly. In the long term, one has to question about how successful such an approach can be. Israel is a fairly small state with a fairly small population, dependent on not only a conscript army, but even more importantly, reservists. And it's a real question about whether Israeli society, the Israeli economy, and of course the Israeli military can sustain this kind of strategy. If we look at the Gaza Strip, postage stamp sized territory with a second order militia in the case of Hamas, which has already been severely weakened. But 2 years on, Israel is still fighting. Now, one can, of course, accept that this masks larger Israeli objectives of the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip and its potential annexation and so on. But I think the mere fact that Israel has been unable to achieve its strictly military objectives in the Gaza Strip is telling about the future of its regional strategy. And I think as time goes on, we may well find ourselves in the situation where Israel's Western sponsors and allies will either have to invest more and more to keep this Israeli strategy viable, or will increasingly have to rein it in to insulate themselves from the consequences of what the havoc Israel is wreaking in the Middle East. And we already see, for example, that the Gulf states, the GCC states, which previously saw Israel as a reliable security partner, now increasingly view it as the regional arsonist, and are normalizing relations not with Israel, but rather with Iran. So those, I think, are things to watch moving forward. In terms of the international response, yes, we have seen growing signs of Western governments that, at least at the rhetorical level, are seeking to distance themselves from Israel. Most prominently, of course, the spate of recognition by Western governments, or either recognition or announcements of an intention to recognize over the summer. And one could say the dam is burst. The West is finally beginning to align its position with the rest of the international community, which largely took this step during the late 1980s. But I think it's important to look at why this is happening. As Yara pointed out towards the conclusion of her remarks, there has been a fundamental and irreversible sea change in Western public opinion towards the question of Palestine. Um, Western publics are increasingly demanding that that their governments and their complicity with the Gaza genocide, with Israel's apartheid against the Palestinian people, and that they take active measures in doing so. These governments are, of course, unresponsive to public opinion. The Western democracies in the 2020s are much less democratic and much less amenable to public pressure than they were, in decades past. And recognition offers, I would argue, a useful diversion. It allows these states to be seen to be doing something meaningful while maintaining business as usual. And I think the position of the European Union best exemplifies this. I'm not saying that recognition is meaningless. Um, symbolic actions can be politically meaningful, but political symbolism without concrete action to accompany it and to make it meaningful is ultimately meaningless. And I'm just looking at the clock, and I'd like to just conclude with one anecdote. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak to a conference that was held in the Slovenian capital, Ljubljana. And before the recording of the talk, I asked my Slovenian hosts, you're a small and vulnerable country. How do you explain that your government has been so far ahead of other EU member states on the issue of Palestine and the Gaza genocide? And the answer I received was that there had recently been a change of government in Slovenia, and the government that was installed basically won the elections on the strength of support from civil society organizations and NGOs and unions and so on. And Slovenia's current leaders are keenly aware that they are dependent on this coalition for their survival in office, and that because of that vulnerability, if I can use that word, they are much more receptive to public opinion and the priorities of public opinion than other governments. For example, the U.S., which is basically now a plutocracy with voting rights. And so this shows that political change can come with proper organizing, but it is also a cautionary note. Policies are not going to change simply because public opinion wants them to. It requires effort, it requires strategic thinking, and unfortunately, it requires time as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Maureen. And we'll turn now to Deanna Butu. Deanna?
Thank you. First, I wanted to also thank the Arab Center, and I wanted to thank you, Yusuf, for inviting me. I also wanted to thank you, Jeremy, Ryan, and Yara for being so generous with your time and with your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. I appreciate your interventions all the time. Yusuf, you had asked me to focus a little bit more on what's going on internally amongst the Israeli public. And so I'm going to hopefully be able to focus on that more than anything else, although I will bring in some other elements as well. So just over a month ago, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel, two Israeli human rights organizations, came out with their reports classifying for the first time by Israeli organizations that what Israel's doing is carrying out genocide. And at the time that they issued their reports, I wrote a piece about their reports, in particular B'Tselem's report, expressing both thanks, but also a little bit of shock and dismay that it took an organization like B'Tselem 22 months into the genocide for them to call it and to label it a genocide. Why am I bringing this up now? For the simple reason that I think that it's been obvious to anybody who's been watching that what Israel has been doing is carrying out genocide. But more than being obvious to anybody who's watching, it's been clear in the way that B'Tselem and these organizations have written their reports that they view the events in October of 2023 as being the catalyst, as they would put it, the catalyst for genocide. I mention this because I think that since the very beginning, that Israel has always had a strategy of carrying out genocide. I think that that has been the strategy since day one. And there have been a number of lawyers and others who, within the first month of Israel genocide, labeled it as a genocide because we knew and saw and listened to exactly what it is that the Israeli officials were saying, and in addition to what the Israeli public is saying and has been saying. I mention this because here we are now, 22 months later, almost 23 months later, and that position has not changed. The only thing that we have seen that has changed within Israeli society is that there's now two main camps that have formed within Israeli society, both of which I'm going to talk about. But neither one of these camps is a camp that is firmly anti-genocide, with very small exceptions. The first camp, which is the camp that we are perhaps seeing the most, and we're seeing the most because it gets covered by international news a lot, is the weekly, sometimes now daily protests and the protest movement that we're seeing primarily in Tel Aviv and in other major cities. And in this protest movement, these are people that are demanding that Israel reach a ceasefire agreement, that they end the war, and so on. And one of the things I think is very important to mention is that a lot of the coverage that we're seeing is actually overblown. There are people who are in the tens and in some cases the hundreds of thousands who are going out to protest. But just in the same way that we had people in the tens and in fact hundreds of thousands who were protesting the quote unquote reform process that the Israelis had been intending to carry out from the start of 2023 up until the genocide began in October of 2023. This is not a protest movement that is in any way, shape, or form disciplined, or that is looking at things from the perspective of what it means to be a Palestinian. In other words, what this protest movement is simply about, as they would put it, bringing back the Israeli soldiers, the Israeli captives, and about ending the war. But for the internal reasons that, one, this is becoming very costly for Israel. Two, this is becoming very embarrassing for Israel because of the growing international movement. And three, they don't like the fact that their soldiers have been going on repeat inside to go into Gaza. The second main camp, which is the camp that we see a lot but don't really see a lot being covered on the news, is the majority camp inside Israel. And that is the camp that is firmly on side with supporting this genocide. Now, in that second camp, this second camp, again, there are splits. There are people who may be joining the protest movement. But for the most part, these are people who actually agree with the idea of wiping Gaza off the map. And we see this insofar as we've seen opinion poll after opinion poll that comes forward and says that 82% of Israelis support the complete ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza, as well as 60 some percent, if you look at the numbers of people who are under the age of 40, who support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, ethnically cleansing them from the state as well. This is all to say that that it would be a huge mistake for us to be focusing, as many in the media have done and as many members of Congress have done, to say that this is all about Netanyahu and this is Netanyahu's war. This isn't just Netanyahu's war, and this isn't just about Netanyahu. This is very much a policy on the part of the government and on the part of the state to be able to finish off the job that they didn't finish off in 1948. And so the critique that I had of B'Tselem and calling the 7th of October as a catalyst, the critique is that it's actually simply a pretext, that this idea of genocide has long sat within the psyche of the Israelis and within the Israeli state, and that now is the opportunity. They've used this opportunity and are going to continue to use this opportunity to push ahead and to push forward. Where does this leave Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship? We're now beginning to see that there are many more protests, and there are protests of people who are genuinely seeking an end to this genocide, including Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, who are now being allowed to go out and protest and are starting to protest en masse. But unfortunately, this is not going to be enough to stop Israel's actions. It's quite the contrary. What the Israeli government is doing is forging on ahead. They know that they have gotten a green light to continue to go on ahead. And at best, it's going to be a scenario in which they seek forgiveness rather than seeking permission to carry out genocide. Where does this leave the PA? This was the other question that Yusuf had asked me to talk about. The PA is where the PA is. The PA has spent the entire nearly 2 years putting its head down, keeping its head down, in the hopes that somehow they won't be the target of the next phase of Israel's genocide. And if anybody should break the news to them, maybe it should be me and maybe you, maybe everybody else here, and say, you're next, because the Israelis have made it absolutely clear that the PA in its current shape, in its current form, is not going to be sticking around for much longer. The actions that they've been doing with everything from the theft of land in the Jerusalem area, people commonly refer to as E1, to the wholesale destruction of the refugee camps in Jenin, in Tulkarem, in Nur Shams, in Far'a, and in other parts of the West Bank is only going to continue. And the Israelis have made it clear that alongside this process of fake recognition, or I don't know what you called it, yes, it was a great term, that they're going to continue to forge ahead to make sure that this recognition is simply recognition on paper and one that Palestinians pay for very dearly. So this is all to say that I think that we are in a moment now where, while the world is recognizing that this is genocide and that Israelis are finally recognizing that this is genocide, we're still lacking the tools to be able to actually stop it. And in fact, it would be a mistake to think that the Israelis want to stop it. They're quite to the contrary. Many of them are very happy with where we are right now.
Thank you so much for that, Diana. And we'll move in a moment to Jeremy to kind of round us out with introductory comments. But before we do that, I just want to remind folks that once we get to the Q&A session, you don't have to wait until the Q&A session to submit your questions. You can do that now through Zoom's Q&A feature or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org, and we'll tackle some of those after we're done with our moderated discussion and introductory comments. So with that, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Well, I just want to co-sign all of the words of gratitude from our fellow panelists and to the Arab Center. And it's really an honor to share this event stage with all of you, because I've interviewed all of you as analysts for investigative stories or analytical stories that I've done, and consider you some of the finest minds that we've had, not just during this genocide, but on the whole history of the Palestinian liberation struggle. So just want to express my deep gratitude to each and every one of you, and to those of you that are joining today. A lot of the reporting that I've been doing over the course of the past 22 months has focused on trying to understand the perspective of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I think that there's been a cartoonized version of what their aims were on October 7th, on who the leadership of these organizations are, on the people that are waging the armed struggle on the ground in Gaza and also in the occupied West Bank. And what we've witnessed throughout the duration of this genocide is, under both the Democratic presidency of Joe Biden and the Republican MAGA presidency of Donald Trump, is the United States conspiring with Israel to ensure that there will not be a ceasefire deal. And I think looking back now, we can say with great clarity that a major part of the charade of negotiations has been to extend Israel's free rein to conduct its scorched earth terror bombing aimed at exterminating the Palestinian people, certainly from Gaza. But as Deanna just said, increasingly the target sites are set on the occupied West Bank. I mean, we're talking at a moment when it seems clear that Israel wants to sever it completely in half ahead of a potential full annexation of large portions, if not the entirety of the occupied West Bank. It's a gravely serious situation, which is accentuated by the fact that the Trump administration, while it does have some complicated political dynamics, while there certainly are some players that are that could be categorized as falling into the anti-interventionist, or even in some cases, maybe even people that are opposed to the U.S. entire underwriting of Israel's military might, it is a administration dominated by very rabid Zionists. And it is personified in the ambassadorship of Mike Huckabee, who has said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian, no such land as the West Bank. So that's the backdrop that we've been watching this negotiation charade unfold. And I think that it's important to state for the record that from the very first days after October 7th, the Hamas leadership, including Yahya Sinwar himself, the late leader of Hamas, and clearly one of the most important figures in the decision to launch Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October 7th, 2023, wanted to make a comprehensive deal and was willing, and I think it was genuine, and it certainly has been genuine at other times during these past 22 months, to do an all-for-all deal. Remember, history didn't start on October 7th. There is an arc of history that is 76 years long, and you can go back before that and talk about the British occupation. But the Palestinian leadership of these organizations is not just looking at what is the current reality, what have the last few years been about. They recognize, and they make this clear, that they're operating in an arc of history that is many decades long. Hamas has repeatedly over the years, various officials and institutionally, offered a hudna, a long-term truce to Israel. And there's been almost no Western news coverage of this, and it's written off as some cynical rhetoric that's been delivered by Hamas. But I think that there is a cartoonish portrayal of the leadership. Many of these people that run Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas are highly educated people. Some of them were educated in the West, but most of them, their entire life stories can be told through a biography that is dotted with occupation, with apartheid, with wars of annihilation, with so-called mowing the lawn. Yahya Sinwar's biography himself. He grew up in the Khan Yunis refugee camp. He spent 2 decades in an Israeli prison. He became fluent in Hebrew and studied the memoirs of the former heads of Shin Bet and other Israeli intelligence services, and then distributed Arabic language versions of them to other prisoners. People can have whatever opinion they want, but make sure that it's based on facts and an understanding that if you didn't have Hamas, you would have other Palestinians that would pick up the gun to wage the exact same battle. Now, Israeli society, as Deanna so eloquently put it, is very singularly focused on just the issue of getting Israeli captives back, while at the same time, overwhelmingly, certainly among Jewish Israelis, supporting the war of erasure against the Palestinian people. But let's talk about captives. Let's talk about hostages. Recently, we learned that there may be as many as 15,000 Palestinians that are being held by Israel, and as many as 4,000 of them were kidnapped by Israel after October 7th for the explicit purpose of using them in exchange deals. You want to talk about the holding of dead bodies. There are believed to be somewhere in the area of 20 deceased Israeli captives being held in Gaza. Israel is holding hundreds of Palestinian bodies, some of them in freezers, some of them in graves marked only by numbers. When the second ceasefire deal was signed on January 17th, 2025, I believe the only reason that Israel agreed to it was because Netanyahu got secret side letters from both outgoing President Joe Biden and incoming President Donald Trump saying that the United States would support Israel if it decided to continue the genocide if it was in its best interests. Yes, there was political pressure. Yes, Trump showed a willingness to force this deal that the criminals from the Biden administration actively refused to do. But let's not pretend that Trump had benign motives. And the fact is that when Israel decided to unilaterally blow up the ceasefire on March 2nd, 2025, and then impose this genocidal siege on Gaza, the prohibition of any life essentials to the Gaza Strip, he did so with the full support of Donald Trump. And on March 18th, he resumed a scorched earth terror bombing campaign that in the opening night killed hundreds of people. On a daily basis, Israel is burning children alive in tents, is imposing a forced starvation campaign, is intentionally trying to destroy any remnant of cities that once stood in Gaza. And at this moment, and my colleague at Dropsite News, Jawa Ahmed, and I have been reporting on this. We've obtained almost every single version of the ceasefire deals that have been put before Hamas in this process. And so we know this material very well. We speak regularly to the negotiators from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas made an extraordinary series of major concessions in the past 10 days or so, and it's gotten almost no attention whatsoever. We published the terms of it. And just to run through quickly what Hamas has agreed to. In this current version, which is a 13-point framework that was drafted not by the regional mediators from Qatar and Egypt, but by Steve Witkoff and Netanyahu's political hitman, Ron Dermer. It's a 13-point plan, and Hamas had tried to amend the language in 3 of those 10 points, but they accepted 10 of them, even poison pills from their perspective. But what Hamas has now agreed to is something that they have not during the course of these negotiations. They have dropped their explicit defined demand that Israel withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor in the south of Gaza. This was something that Netanyahu had defined as one of his red lines. And the regional mediators, particularly from Egypt, had told Hamas, this is going to be a sticking point. So the Egyptians, I'm told, by sources involved with the negotiations, made a commitment to Hamas that they would deal with this issue of a withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor on a bilateral basis because of the treaties that exist between Egypt and Israel. Hamas has a lot of reasons to be suspicious of Egypt, particularly under Sisi's administration. The democratically elected president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, died in a prison cell after a coup that brought Sisi to power. Sisi is no friend of Hamas. But they agreed to that. They took out language that would have had an entire withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor within 50 days of signing a deal. They also adjusted their position on the influx of humanitarian aid and other life essentials to the Gaza Strip. Hamas has said, and Yara touched on this, Hamas has said that it wants to go back to a system defined in the January ceasefire agreement where hundreds of trucks a day would be brought in and the distribution would be overwhelmingly coordinated and run by the United Nations. Israel, in the original drafts of these ceasefires, didn't even mention the United Nations. They just wanted it to be negotiated at a later point. But what Hamas did in the last concessions that they made is that in July, they had said, we want language that says only international organizations that were operating in the Gaza Strip before March 2nd can be involved with aid distribution. And they explicitly said, we demand a dismantling of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites. That is gone from the agreement that they signed now, which means that the door is open for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, despite the fact that its operations have resulted in the killing of at least 1,000 Palestinians. Some estimates indicate but Hamas has dropped that. They also reduced their demands on the number of Palestinians serving life sentences that would be freed in these exchange deals. They originally wanted 200. They've dropped it to 140 and said that we'll allow 60 Palestinians serving 15 years or more to replace those. They also cut by 500 the number of Palestinian hostages that were taken after October 7th explicitly to be used in these deals. One of the main aims of Al-Aqsa Flood was to free as many Palestinian hostages, captives, prisoners as possible. And so Hamas has hit a point now where I think that part of the motivation, and I realize my time is running short here, part of the motivation of accepting these concessions was because Hamas and Islamic Jihad are under enormous pressure from inside of Gaza. The Israeli pressure is so secondary, no matter what Donald Trump's Truth Social account wants to say. Major families in Gaza, major clans in Gaza, the family members of the external Hamas political leadership, they are putting unprecedented pressure on them to make a deal. So on the one hand, Hamas said, yeah, okay, we are going to strip this down to the basement. We are conceding everything we can short of surrendering the Palestinian cause of liberation, because that's what they believe the stakes are here. It's not about Hamas. Hamas has said for months, we will resign from government. They put it in writing in the ceasefire proposals. Witkoff takes it out of it. Israel takes it out of it. Ask yourself why. So at the end of the day, what we're witnessing right now is Hamas doing two things. One, saying, here's the bare minimum. And if Israel won't accept this, they won't accept any deal. And on the other hand, they're saying, let's test this. Does Israel really want its captives back? Did Israel really believe in the 13-point framework that they put before us months ago after they unilaterally blew up the ceasefire deal? Or do they want something else? So the news of the past 48 hours is Israel says, we're not going to negotiate anymore in Egypt or Qatar. We want a third country. And we're not going to negotiate on the Witkoff plan, which they've been demanding Hamas accept, and now Hamas has accepted it. And they say, no, we need to start over. It has to be an all-for-all deal, meaning a comprehensive deal. And so these maximalist demands by Israel are all part of the charade I mentioned at the beginning of this. The whole aim of dragging on these negotiations is not to get concessions from Hamas. It's to kill more Palestinians. It's to do more scorched earth. It's to make Gaza even less inhabitable, even if the unthinkable happens and somehow Trump were to force the end of this war. What they did to Rafah, they want to do to Gaza City, and then Deir al-Balah is next. So while I'm reporting on this, Jawa and I are reporting on this all the time because we think it's in the public interest, we are very clear-eyed about what's happening here. And what's happening is they're using the veneer of negotiations to continue to extend their genocidal, serial killing rampage against people who happen to be born Palestinian.
Thank you very much for that, Jeremy. And I want to go back to you in a little bit with additional questions about the negotiations, especially that are going on now. But I have questions for others as well, and I want to start with Yara. And once we get through one question each, we'll turn to questions from the audience. So if you haven't sent your question in, please go ahead and do that. Yara, the news of the last week or so was around the IPC report. You obviously mentioned that in your comments, which declared famine in parts of the Gaza Strip. You touched a little bit about this. I was wondering if there's one thing that you could sort of respond to. We see a lot of and this is not new. I have to say this is something we've seen for years in the context of Gaza since the siege began so many years ago. Essentially, these Israeli government talking points, propaganda points, really, that will use a picture of a market that has some food in it, or a restaurant that's serving a sandwich, or a Palestinian who doesn't look emaciated and say, how can there be a famine here? Look at this. Here's proof that the entire world is lying. The entire world is Hamas, including the UN and the IPC and everything. You're having the wool pulled over your eyes, right? And here's the proof. Some person is having a sandwich in Gaza. Can you respond to this and help folks understand? Because I think most people who pay close attention understand that this is obvious nonsense. But it may muddy the waters for some who are a little bit less familiar with the reality on the ground and what Palestinians are going through on a regular basis to try to actually access food. And so, if you can help us understand why this is absurd to make such claims, and why it can both be true that yeah, there might be a spot or two in Gaza where there might be some incredibly expensive food that's available, but when we're talking about things like famine, there are other metrics that are important. So, I just wanted to ask you to kind of break that down for us.
Yeah, thank you, Yusuf, for bringing attention to this. This is a product, or perhaps an extension of a nearly century-long project to discredit and delegitimize any Palestinian claims. If you look back in history, everything that we are seeing today, the settlement expansion, the land seizures, the seizure in Jerusalem, the repression of Palestinian citizens of Israel, the blockade of Gaza, all of that initially was all deemed, hyperbolic, that Palestinians were overreacting, that nothing bad was really happening. And if something was happening, it's not that bad. Like, what's the big deal? Like we have been hearing this over and over. Now with this famine designation, it's kind of interesting. It's like the same argument, people say, well, it can't be genocide because then they'd kill all of them. So now the argument is, well, it can't be famine because not every single person is starving. And that has never been how we defined famine. And it is, which I'll get into in a second, but what a what a weird view of the world to say that because not every single person that I'm seeing is starving, everybody is lying. If we could just pause and think through that viewpoint, it's just very shocking to me. So back to the definition. So the criteria for famine is indicative of a process that's happening. The thing with these designations of genocide and famine is not to have a name to call the thing after it happens. It is because external parties and states have an obligation to prevent these things from happening. Calling them genocide or famine is simply saying, you failed to stop it. So now it's happening. So then it becomes like a different level of intervention. So this is, it's almost like we can't acknowledge anything bad happening to the Palestinians until all of them are dead and gone. And then we can say, what a shame. Nobody did anything to intervene at any point. So here's the criteria for famine. At least 20% of households face catastrophe, which means a lack of food that leads to acute malnutrition and mortality. At least 30% of children under 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. And we have heard from clinics on the ground, including by NGOs like Save the Children and others, that they're seeing unprecedented cases of malnutrition in children. As we know, children, disabled people, the elderly, people whose bodies are just more vulnerable are more prone to suffering the effects of famine first. So that's why we are seeing those populations. And even that is being used as a tool to discredit Palestinian claims of famine. It's not famine because only disabled children are dying. This is somehow seen as some sort of counter argument to the proposition that there's famine. And then the third criteria is that at least 2 of every 10,000 adults die each day from non-trauma causes. So this could be malnutrition and hunger, or as I said, it could be they get the flu, they get an infection from a cut or an injury, and their body is too weak to fight it. And you start to see escalated deaths from there. So this is why, in terms of the declaration of famine, and I know some food experts who don't even like this concept of declaring famine, as it's something that some external agency has the right to do over a population, when the people in Gaza have been telling us that they've been starving for more than 2 years. But that is why, for now, it is localized to the Gaza City area. Gaza City is in the north. This is an area that Israel has continually posed evacuation orders, continues to bomb, continues to try to push people out of. People are still there. Very little aid can get there, if any. And like I said earlier, the little aid that exists is primarily in the south. So for those who want to stay in the north, it's difficult. So no criteria says everyone has to be dying and starving. Some of the hunger is coming from the fact that there may be some food in some markets, but if you look at the costs of food, it is unaffordable for people. Bags of flour, bottles of olive oil, za'atar, these kind of like household staples are becoming extremely difficult to afford for most people. Most people are going multiple days in a row without eating. Most, you know what I'm saying? So this is this emblematic, trend that we've seen, which is that if there is a single counterexample that people can point to, and increasingly these counterexamples are not even from Gaza. The time period that these videos and photos are taken is unclear, but nobody is saying there is no food anywhere in Gaza. There is famine conditions in parts of Gaza that are going to expand if there is not immediate aid to be brought in. Do we need to wait until everybody is starving before we consider this an issue? Just like, do we need to wait until every Palestinian is displaced from Gaza and the West Bank to call it ethnic cleansing? Do we need to wait for the bad thing to happen before we can call what's happening bad? This is a standard that is so strangely placed on the Palestinians that if not all of you are suffering to a level that I, random person on the internet, deem is worthy of sympathy, then you're not suffering at all. So I think this is propaganda. This is something that is not applied to similar standards. I don't see people questioning famine in Sudan or when there was famine in Yemen. This is because Israelis and their allies don't want to admit or don't want to concede that their policies have caused this obvious humanitarian catastrophe that is obviously man-made and is obviously a result of Israeli policy. So rather than reckon with that reality, we just pretend it's not happening.
Thanks very much for addressing that, Yara. Marina, I wanted to ask you one thing that you mentioned in your analysis, in your introductory remarks, talking about sort of this new sort of Israeli posture and how difficult it might be to maintain over time, given the scale and scope of it, and also the fact that Israel is a small country and it's dependent on a lot of outside help, particularly from the United States. And you noted, as others had as well, that there are trends in opinion that are shifting here in the United States, which call into question how long and sustainable that support can be over time for such a strategy. But one word you used to describe it, which caught my attention, was irreversible. And I wanted to ask you about that because there, I'm sure, is an argument that is being made in some rooms in Tel Aviv, perhaps among Israel lobby organizations in the United States, that are unhappy with shifts in opinion. They're unhappy with what they're seeing on the internet, the conversations that are taking place, the general sort of shift in the climate around U.S. support for Israel. But they don't seem to be that concerned, and they might think, well, this will blow over. It's more important for us to try to create as many changes, new realities on the ground, reach for what we can while we can, and disregard what's happening now because it'll go away, or it won't be this bad, or so on. And so when you said irreversible, I wanted to ask you to respond perhaps to that possibility. Why, in your view, do you believe? I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but I'd like for you to just expand on why you believe that it is moving just in one direction from now on.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think that analysis, as the Israeli analysis as you presented it, is essentially half right. Yes, Israel is determined to grab what it can and to achieve as much as it can, as long as it's given sufficient leash length by its sponsors and allies in Washington, Brussels, London, and elsewhere. But it's doing so increasingly in defiance of global public opinion. You're entirely correct. Even in the 1970s, vast majority of Western citizens didn't even know what Nakba meant. Perhaps they thought it was some kind of Middle Eastern spice. Um, Sabra Shatila blew over, and so much else blew over. But you've had this accumulation of things that have created during the Gaza genocide what I would call a Sharpeville moment for Israel. Of course, historical analogies are always imperfect. But if we go back to 1960, the year of the Sharpeville massacre, we have to recall that racial discrimination was basically the law of the land in the United States. The idea that blacks are subhuman, or specifically Africans are subhuman and need to be kept in their place, was kind of conventional wisdom in the West. But even under those circumstances, um, what the white minority regime in South Africa did in Sharpeville was considered so beyond the pale, even given the prevailing mentality in much of the West in those days, that it never recovered from it, and it was in a sense the beginning of the end. And I think similarly here, I mean, when you know, public opinion in the United States has traditionally been pro-Israel. Israel's greatest strategic asset is not its nuclear arsenal. It's not the F-35s it receives and other advanced weapons. It's the solid bipartisan support that it has traditionally enjoyed from the US political elite, and the solid bipartisan support that is not the sole product of the Israel lobby by any means, but used to reflect popular opinion in the United States. That's no longer the case. I mean, you're now even, getting a split within the Republican Party. You're now even getting growing voices within the evangelical community. And I think in this sense, Iran was a turning point. Yes, people didn't like to see slaughtered children on their television screens every day and so on. But the perception that people had, rightly or wrongly, that Israel was dragging the US into precisely the kind of war that Trump had pledged to avoid and was in significant part elected to avoid. I think for many people on the MAGA right, what was a turning point and led to them breaking with Israel. Now, I say irreversible because I think for Israel, Israel didn't invade Gaza, eliminate its enemies, expel the Palestinians, and then annex the Gaza Strip in the space of a week or a month or a year. It's been almost 2 years, and it's going to continue for very much longer. And so and it's live streamed. These aren't things you read about in your newspaper or hear a news anchor relating over a 6 o'clock news broadcast. It's 24/7. And I think for Israel, the damage easily equals that which was inflicted, self-inflicted by South Africa's white minority regime in Sharpeville, Soweto, 76. I can't see under any circumstances Israel somehow putting this in the memory hole. It's that's just not how history works, I think.
Very well. Thank you, Maureen, for that response. I want to turn to Diana now with a question. I know I had asked in your introductory remarks to kind of give us a sense of the domestic picture in Israel, but I want to ask you about something different that we touched on and to put your sort of international law hat on, and that's on this question of recognition of a Palestinian state. I think we're largely on the same page that a lot of it is performative and not going to have a significant impact in any way, certainly not to address the urgent needs on the ground for the people of Gaza. But I wanted to ask you about what particular legal implications might follow, what avenues might open up in terms of accountability, for example, when you have recognition of a Palestinian state in a place like the UK, in a place like France or Canada, are there avenues that then open up for some kind of redress for Palestinians to hold Israel accountable in some way within those different countries because that recognition has happened?
So yes, there are. And look, I think it's important for me to step back and say that there are already 140 countries that have recognized Palestine. There are actually, I haven't done the exact math, but I think it's more countries that have recognized Palestine than have recognized Israel. The difference is that it's the Western countries that have not yet recognized Palestine, and in the coming month, there will be the big festival of recognition that's going to begin. I would have preferred that these same countries recognize Israel's genocide. And the reason that I would have preferred that they recognize the genocide is that because genocide is something that countries have an obligation to prevent, them recognizing it as a genocide, which it is, would have then required these countries to do something to stop Israel from continuing to carry it out. Okay, so again, it's not something like, oh, there's a genocide and it's far too late. The whole point is to blow the whistle and to say, everything is indicating that this is genocide. We need to do something to stop it. That's why there were two very important things that happened. One was the ICJ decision that came out saying that there was a plausible case for genocide, then puts an onus on other states to do something to stop it. Plus, there was a decision that came out in July of 2024 saying that Israel's occupation, by the ICJ, by the way, Israel's occupation is illegal, not just in the way that they're carrying out, but the mere fact that it still exists. And so both of these decisions put an onus on other states to do something. So when you have the combination of the obligation vis-a-vis genocide, the obligation that came out of the July 2024 case that says that no state should be recognizing the occupation, they should be doing everything to pull out. Those two alone put obligations on different states to do something. Now, what happened is that nobody did anything. This third step of actually recognizing a Palestinian state, yes, one would hope that by taking this additional step, these states are now going to recognize that the other two steps that were already told that they should be following, one being stopping genocide, two being pulling out from the occupation, that they'll now start recognizing both of these. Are there avenues for redress? Absolutely. It's everything from pushing to stop the weapons flow going into Israel, specifically an arms embargo, because of the fact that if you recognize that this is a state and you've recognized the decisions by the ICJ, if you've accepted them, then there is no reason that arms should be continuing to flow to Israel because they're using those weapons to both carry out a genocide and maintain an illegal occupation of a state that you have recognized. So yes, there are things that can flow from this, but but these things are not self-executing. And this is where I share the viewpoint of everybody on the panel who's expressed a viewpoint on this, is that this isn't going to be just a question of, oh, yes, this is wonderful, there's recognition. There needs to be active measures and active steps taken to actually make sure that this recognition isn't just a way of evading responsibility and not recognizing genocide, but instead a question of actually doing things. So yes, there could be an arms embargo. Two, breaking off of free trade agreements, because Israel is not separating itself from the territory that they're defining as a state. Three, pushing in terms of Jerusalem and what it is that they recognize and don't recognize. Four, putting into place measures against the illegal settlers. Five, putting into place measures against Israeli citizens who end up going to an army that's serving as an occupation army. There are many, many, many things that can be done. But again, this is going to be something that requires us to continue to push rather than just let it step back and just be an alternative to actually doing something vis-a-vis the genocide.
Thank you very much, Deanna. Jeremy, I want to go back to you. You touched a little bit on this towards the end of your comments. But now, of course, there was apparently Hamas has agreed to the points that you've noted, and it seems like the Israelis are uninterested in providing any response to this. One thing we hear about in the reporting around these deals is sort of the type of deal that is being discussed, whether it is incremental or comprehensive. We know that Hamas at the outset was willing to do a comprehensive deal. That's something, of course, that didn't happen. There were partial deals that were then pursued, both in November of 2023 and then later on in 2025 and so on. But now we're hearing sort of different things reported from the Israeli side. At one stage, they say they want a comprehensive deal. They reject an incremental deal, even if Hamas agrees to it. They say they want a comprehensive deal. And then if Hamas agrees to some sort of comprehensive deal, they say they want a incremental deal. When there seems to be a positive response, they say, well, we want a different set of mediators. Could you kind of run us through the different patterns you've observed in these negotiations, particularly in Israeli responses, and what it tells us about what their actual intentions are?
Yeah, one of the moments during this genocide regarding the negotiations that I think is really telling happened in May, June, July of 2024. So we're talking about half a year left in the presidency of Joe Biden, and there was the first sort of shorter length ceasefire proposal put on the table after the November 2023 exchange of captives deal that was a temporary truce. And it was the first time that I had been leaked a document regarding the internal negotiations. And the document that I was shown indicated that there was a very technical disagreement on a matter of like one or two sentences. I think it was actually one sentence, and that was holding up the entire deal. Israel was telling the Biden administration that if this language doesn't change, we aren't going to make a deal. And so Qatar, Egypt, and the Americans put together, they workshopped like 3 or 5 different versions of that line. And they went back to Israel and they asked Israel, which version of this would you accept? And the Israelis then told them. They then presented that through the mediators to Hamas. And Hamas was told that this is the line that Israel wants. And the Americans have said, if you agree to this, we've got a deal. This is May, June of 2024. So Hamas deliberates on it. And by the way, we always just talk about Hamas. Hamas from the beginning has always consulted with a range of other Palestinian factions. At the beginning, it was those factions that were also holding captives. But if you've seen, and I know Deanna and others know about this, if you've seen recently, there's been a flurry of activity. They have widened the circle dramatically. If they give a response to the mediators, they want it to be coming from, Abbas's people are boycotting this, but an enormous number of Palestinian leaders and parties are participating in this discourse. But to back up, so Hamas then says, okay, we'll accept that amended language. And then a month goes by. And on July 2nd, then Hamas writes formally to the mediators and said, just to reiterate, we have accepted this deal. And what happened after that is that Antony Blinken and Joe Biden facilitated Israel entirely blowing it up, even though Hamas had in writing, and it's written on it by the mediators in Arabic, this is the one the Americans say will make the deal. So I've witnessed this now from that moment, starting in May, June of 2024 to this to today, and I've seen this happen repeatedly, where Hamas is told, well, if you just do this, the Americans assure us that they'll keep the Israelis in check and we'll have a deal. It's just happened over and over and over again. And on the issue, so with these incremental deals, Hamas, whether it's a comprehensive or it's a short-term, three-phase deal, Hamas's bottom line is all Israeli forces need to leave the Gaza Strip, but they have agreed repeatedly to having a buffer zone, that would encircle the entirety of the Gaza Strip. Yes, they want the Rafah border crossing to be opened, but they've agreed to it. In the last round, just 10 days ago or so, Hamas actually amended its position and said the Israelis could occupy even deeper into Gaza than they had previously wanted. At one point, it's 1,500 meters inside of Gaza. And the difference is like 50 meters here, 200 meters here. So Hamas is willing to accept this buffer entirely around Gaza. And the Israelis were saying, oh, these maps are unacceptable. Hamas basically then concedes to the entire mapping that Israel wanted after the US told them they needed to draw new maps. And now the whole thing has been blown up again. Hamas wants all Israeli forces out with the exception of a buffer zone, which is, from their view, not occupation forces, but is essentially a kind of concertina wired off section that will go all around the Gaza Strip. They say that they want humanitarian aid to be delinked from any political process, that food cannot be used as a weapon of war, that food and other life essentials shouldn't even be part of negotiations, that you can't starve an entire population to compel a political organization that was the last democratically elected power structure in Gaza. You can't punish them punish the people for their refusal to capitulate to Israel's ever evolving demands. And then they're saying we will relinquish power to an independent committee as long as it's Palestinian led. They've indicated openness to having it to fall under the auspices of the totally decrepit, unpopular Palestinian Authority. Who's vetoing that? Netanyahu's people are vetoing that. So, people can have any number of criticisms of Hamas that they want, and there is a vibrant dialogue in the Palestinian community about that. But what you can't do is invent facts. And I think, objectively speaking, the Palestinian side and their negotiators have at every turn been the flexible party, have offered an all-for-all deal, have offered a 3 to 7 year truce at various points that would be backed up under threat of the United States allowing Israel to come in and resume the genocide again. So it's not about, we all have been sucked into the vortex of Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. What is at stake here is the very existence of the Palestinian people. Hamas is not a foreign antigen that was injected into the body of Palestine. They are the sons and daughters of Palestine. Whether you disagree with them politically, those are matters for the Palestinian people to discuss amongst themselves. But every person who's picked up the gun for Soraya al-Quds or for the Qassam brigades or for any number of other armed factions, those are Palestinians whose entire lives have been lived in a concentration camp, whose entire lives have been lived being told, you're less than human, you're human animals, you're monsters, we're going to restrict your calorie, we're going to drone strike you, we're going to mow the lawn, we're going to shoot your grandfather in the face, we're going to starve your grandmother, we're going to force you into a reality where your grandparents carry around a key from a house that was stolen from their family in 1948 and 1949 when the war of extermination began by an apartheid regime imposed by by Europe and the United States on the Palestinian people. So, we need to not be afraid to say, yes, the Palestinian people have a right to armed resistance. And when they say we want to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, what they're saying is we want to end the Palestinian struggle for liberation. That's the fact. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. If the Palestinians disarm, it is over.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. And I will say, I think, the fact that you have the Israelis even rejecting the idea that there will be any sort of Palestinian self-government in Gaza or any sort of Palestine, even under the leadership of factions which have effectively given up armed resistance, right? Tells you that the issue from Israel's perspective is not about whether it is a Palestinian armed or unarmed group. It's that it's a Palestinian group. The issue that they seem to have is Palestinian existence in Gaza. I want to move now to some of the questions in the time that we have left from the audience, and there are a lot. But Diana, maybe I'll direct this one to you. There's a question that says here, I've read that Israeli citizens only see the Netanyahu slash Israeli military version of what's happening in Gaza. Can this explain the incredibly high percentage of Israeli citizens supporting the genocide? Can you touch on that?
Okay, sure, sure. So, Israel's got internet like every other place around the world, and it's actually pretty cheap. We also have access to everything. The only sites that are blocked are very few websites, but everything that you all are seeing is the same stuff that can be viewed here. That's not correct. The difference is that Israelis don't want to watch the things that you and I and everybody else is watching, and they prefer instead to watch the stuff that is on the mainstream television, which, by the way, is propaganda. It's all probably the different channels are run by the different political parties. And it's really interesting to actually watch that TV because at the beginning of the genocide, you would see how some of the channels would go out of their way to try to give reasons for why it is that they were doing things. So, for example, they would say, we had to bomb this hospital because there was somebody from Hamas there, or we had to destroy these homes in order to widen the streets so that the tank could get through. These are things that like everyday Israeli would say, all right, yeah, okay, I get it. I might not like it, but I get it. Today, they don't even do that. Today, the media is now saying we can kill 150 people and nobody's going to say anything. So the view that the idea that somehow they don't have access to the stuff that you and I and everybody else is seeing is false. It's that they choose to watch this. And in particular, they're choosing to watch and to take the commentary that one, there is no famine, two, that there are no people who are innocent. And most particularly, and this just happened yesterday, with the killing of journalists. You have actually Israeli journalists who are coming out and saying, yes, it's a good thing that we are targeting journalists. Okay, these are Israeli journalists who are saying this. So there is access to the news, to everything. They do have internet, it's not blocked. But again, it's just an idea that they choose because of the fact that at its core, Israel is a society. It's a state that's built on genocide. This is not the first genocide. 1948 was the first genocide. It's built on genocide and built on ethnic cleansing. And the only way that you can maintain that genocide and that ethnic cleansing is through propaganda, which is what they have done. And the only way that you can actually live in Israel is if you believe in a process of dehumanization, either you believe you're either a Nakba denier, you're a Nakba apologist, or you're a Nakba cheerleader. And it's the same when it comes to the genocide.
Thank you, Diana. We're pressed for time, but I do want to try to address one last question. And Yara, perhaps you can tackle this one. And this is a question about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And the question is sort of what is the motive behind these repeated massacres at the GHF sites? So if GHF is intended to create the illusion that they're providing aid, it seems sort of counterproductive to also make them the sites of repeated and systematic massacres, which we've learned from whistleblowers and, of course, from tons of testimonies and video evidence is happening on the regular. So how do we understand this? And we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, I will very briefly answer this. And I guess the real question is it counterproductive? They're doing it, and no one has stopped it. They can do it, and so they're doing it. This is the case with so many things. I think the purpose of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, just like the purpose of the Biden humanitarian peer, just like the purpose of the aid drops that have killed more than 100 Palestinians and are derided by every humanitarian agency on the planet, This is to provide the pretense that aid is being distributed, A, to dispute the claims of famine, B, because even in today's day and age when maybe everything is acceptable, the idea of completely blocking an entire civilian population from every necessity needed to live is probably not a good thing. But, despite all the evidence, Yusuf, that you just laid out, people deny that this is happening. They don't believe that it's happening. They say that if it is happening, the Palestinians being killed deserve it. It's an accident. The same playbook that we have seen time and time again, for any number of violations. So the question of why do it if the goal is to look good, the answer is because they can.
Thanks very much for that answer, Yaron. With that, we'll conclude our conversation today. I really want to thank all of you for dealing with a really wide range of issues as we think through what comes next in Gaza. And we appreciate your time and engaging with our audience today as well. Thank you all, and please continue to follow the work of the Arab Center at arabcenterdc.org. And we'll continue to cover this issue and many more in following events.